Life on this planet has always been a challenge. We take comfort in the fact that our feet are planted firmly on solid ground. But the foundation upon which life is built is not always so firm. Our city streets disguise dangers that lie far beneath, hidden but waiting to strike. The planet's surface may seem constant, but what lies beneath is forever on the move. Geological forces shift entire continents so slowly that at first they go unnoticed, creating stress on the Earth's crust. It is only a matter of time before that stress must be released.
You have large tectonic plates that are moving past each other, and in places they get locked together. And when the stress building up, because they're moving, exceeds the friction, they snap. Where the plates meet each other, there's the most frequent earthquakes. And that includes, for instance, the Rim of Fire, the Pacific Rim, all around the Pacific Plate, Japan, New Zealand, the Pacific Islands, all the way up to Alaska, down the coast of Washington and Oregon, and then into California as the San Andreas Fault, and that continues south into the west side of Mexico and Central America.
In Japan, the region around Tokyo Bay, known as Kantō, has one of the highest frequencies of earthquakes in the country. But for the first 20 years of the 20th century, it experiences a decline in seismic activity. There are fewer earthquakes, but also fewer opportunities for stress underground to be released. 2 earthquakes do strike the area in 1921 and 1922, but cause only moderate damage to Yokohama and the nation's capital, Tokyo. The previous decade has been good to these 2 cities. By the fall of 1923, 2.5 million people live in Tokyo, and Yokohama is a thriving international port of over 400,000. Saturday, September 1st, 1923. The morning has been sunny and very hot. Strong winds are all that remain of an overnight rainstorm.
People were having an ordinary life. September 1st happened to be the day the new school term started.
Just before noon, in thousands of homes and restaurants in Tokyo, Yokohama, and villages in between, people are lighting charcoal fires in preparation for lunch. Yoshiko Miyamatsu is 13 years old and lives with her family in Yokohama.
It was an uneventful morning. I went to the koto lesson and came home as I was going to have lunch. My grandfather, grandmother, the 4 children, and mother, 7 of us, were at home.
9-year-old Sadeo Amano is also at home. He lives with his grandparents on their silkworm farm just south of Tokyo.
That was Saturday, and the school was a half day. Well, it's quite warm that day. We went to swimming right beside the house.
Mitsuo Amemori is just started his first job.
My father was 19 years old in 1923. He was in Tokyo, and he just finished high school, so he was working there in the post office. And the rest of his family lived in Canada.
Professor Akitsune Imamura is in his study at the University of Tokyo, where he heads the Seismological Observatory.
Imamura had, over the previous few decades, said that he expected a large earthquake in the in the bay south of Tokyo, and that such an earthquake would cause huge loss of life in terms of casualties from basically from fires that would result. And he said this publicly and was pretty much denounced for his claims.
It is 11:58 in the morning. Professor Imamura's prophecy is about to come true. In his office at the University of Tokyo, seismology professor Akitsune Imamura feels the first tremble of what appears to be a minor tremor. 12 seconds later, he knows it is much more.
As the earthquake progressed, roof tiles began to fall. There was no longer doubt as to its serious character. The building rocked like a great ship tossed in ocean waves.
Not far away, in a Tokyo post office, Mitsuo Amemori and his fellow workers are running for their lives.
Everybody was running helter-skelter everywhere because the earth was cracking open here and there. A fellow worker and he were running behind him, and he disappeared between the cracks, and he's never seen him again.
Some 30 kilometers away, in Yokohama, Yoshiko Miyamatsu and her family are having lunch when the earthquake rattles their home.
I felt violent shakes to the side. I was really surprised and kept screaming. The wall started to fall down, and it became very chaotic. Drawers were moving, and things on the shelves were falling. Terrible things were happening. All the children held hands and went outside, but the ground was cracking, and if a foot fell into it, you would get stuck. I was crawling, but I was still falling. The shaking was that bad.
The earthquake measures 8.3 on the Richter scale. Its horizontal motion wreaks havoc on the wood and concrete buildings of the Kantō region.
If the earthquake is of magnitude 8 and it happens out in the middle of the ocean, it might not even be felt. If it happens underneath a city, it's going to be devastating. The Kantō earthquake was south of Tokyo. As you go further south towards the actual earthquake fault, Yokohama is about half the distance that Tokyo was, and I'd say about 10 to 12% of the houses collapsed in Yokohama. So the shaking was much higher than it was in Tokyo.
And the way a Japanese building is constructed is it's wooden, of course, but the roof is heavily made of tile, ceramic tile. Yeah, the swaying would cause the building to sort of pancake.
What happens is the building moves probably to the side too much in such a way that it can't hold itself up against gravity. So gravity actually is what pulls building down in an earthquake, not the earthquake itself.
Farms and villages that dot the countryside also suffer the quake's attack. Sadeo Amano and his friends are swimming in a nearby stream when the first tremor hits.
The earthquake couldn't get out right. Of course, everybody get out and try to go home right now. 90% of the houses all fell down anyway.
Fortunately, Sadeo's grandparents and older sister are safe. Many more are not. Along the coast, cliffs break off in giant slabs 100 feet thick. An entire village is buried in a massive mud flow. As seawaters recede and return with the movement of the earth, huge waves batter the coast.
Some areas you had up to 10 feet, 3 meters of ocean moving in. Other places was up to about 30 feet, 10 meters. That caused quite a bit of damage to some of the local cities on the coast.
In Yokohama Harbor, the Canadian Pacific steamship, the Empress of Australia, is just minutes from departure on its way to Vancouver. Captain and crew watch as buildings along the harbor front dissolve like castles of sand. The initial tremor subsides after several minutes. But it is not the end. A more ferocious enemy is about to show itself, smoldering beneath the rubble and ruin.
Everybody used charcoal. We used charcoal in a portable clay cooking stove to prepare lunch. It was at 11:58, so every household was preparing lunch. When the roof and everything collapsed, the fire started immediately and spread to a sea of flames in front of our eyes.
The initial quake shatters water mains, leaving little means to fight the fires. It also ruptures underground gas lines. In both Tokyo and Yokohama, hundreds of fires burn out of control. All anyone can do is try to escape.
People started moving in the directions of open spaces, and typically that would be parks. Unfortunately, these were death traps because they weren't that large, and the fires would eventually encroach the entire area and create their own windstorm.
In Tokyo, almost 40,000 men, women, and children take refuge in the open spaces of a military clothing depot. Many have rescued bedrolls, furniture, and clothing from ravaged homes, all they have left in the world. Now their belongings become fuel for the fires that surround and engulf them. There are no survivors. In another part of Tokyo, Mitsuo Amemori is swept along by crowds trying to stay ahead of the flames.
He saw this girl about 5 to 8 years old, and she was really crying, and he thought, well, maybe he can go and grab her and help her, but he got pushed away with a throng that he never saw again.
Many try to cross canals spanned by wooden bridges, but fires on both sides force them into the water. In some places, there are enough corpses in the canals to allow survivors to cross without getting their feet wet.
There were bodies floating all over, and as the waves would come and go, the bodies would move. I was stunned when I saw it. It was all rotten, and the smell was awful.
The huge tremor that hits the Kantō region of Japan on September 1st, 1923, is not the last. Over 100 aftershocks occur that day, some almost as strong as the first.
There was telegraphs and telephone lines, but all those were immediately interrupted. Power went out. All the utilities were basically immediately cut off.
In Yokohama Harbor, the steamship Korea sends a distress signal to the governor of Tokyo. There is no reply. Tokyo, like Yokohama, is fighting for its life. There are other ships in Yokohama Harbor that day, yachts, cargo boats, and foreign passenger liners, including the Empress of Australia, still moored to the battered pier. In the Japanese district of Yokohama, Yoshiko Miyamatsu and her family look for safety in another direction.
I took my younger sisters, and all of us escaped to the small hill at the other side of the small river. And at the top of the hill, we spent the night. There was nothing to eat, and nothing to wear, and no beddings. There was nothing we could do.
As day turns to dusk, survivors gather on the burning shoreline of Yokohama Harbor. Throughout the night, lifeboats transport them to waiting ships. Sunday, September 2nd, 1923. Fires still burn in Yokohama, Tokyo, and the surrounding area. Those who survive the night look for ways to leave the stricken area behind.
Population was originally 2.5 million on September 1st, and within the next few days, it went down to about 1.25 million. As the trains and other public transportation came back online, people were encouraged to take advantage of that, of free transport to go to different parts of the country to seek refuge.
Those who stay are left with images they will never forget.
もうそれこそもう見渡す限り全部出て帰って後で来てみたら
When I came back the next day, there were almost no houses. Everything was burnt. In front of my house, somebody's foot fell in the crack in the ground, and the fire came, so the person burnt to death. It was totally black.
Aftershocks continue. At the University of Tokyo, Professor Akitsune Amemura and his team record more than 200 over the next few days, including several major tremors which add to the destruction. In cities, towns, and villages throughout the region, hundreds of thousands of homes have been destroyed or damaged. Power and water will take days, even weeks to restore.
And after 2-3 days, the water shut it off. Then the grandfather said, you better go down the village, somebody got the well, go and get the water like. So that's what I do in about first week anyway, carrying the water home like.
In Tokyo and Yokohama, stores, hospitals, and government offices no longer exist. Damage is as much as $4.5 billion US.
About 95% of all the structures that were lost were due to fires. The fires destroyed entire ministries, entire departments of the government. It was just an enormous tragedy in terms of what was lost, not only in terms of property value, but also culturally.
The death toll is estimated as high as 140,000. Thousands of bodies, many unidentified, are burned in cremation pits. Relief efforts, however, are underway.
The United States, Britain, France, and a few other countries had military vessels sent to the ports of Japan immediately with supplies, and so there's a vast number of people that were homeless, probably 1 million people in Tokyo alone, and so the supplies were needed to feed and to shelter and medical supplies right away.
An American military ship came to the Yokohama harbor and supplied blankets. 1 blanket per 2 people. Until then, we didn't have anything to cover, so every morning our hair was all wet, as if it had rained, because of the dew. But after blankets were given, we put them over our heads.
Yoshiko Miyamatsu's family eventually builds a new home in their old neighborhood. But some residents, like Mitsuo Amemori, must rebuild their lives elsewhere.
His grandparents were all in Canada, and so told him to come to Canada because he lost everything in the fire afterwards. He didn't have anything.
The 1923 Kantō disaster ushers in a new age of earthquake engineering, both in Japan and the world.
But they had a large conference in Tokyo after the earthquake, and people from all around the world came and talked, and I think it was kind of the beginning of, let's say, serious international discussion of the issues around seismic design.
Discussions at the conference focus on what kinds of construction can best withstand the destructive force of an earthquake.
There was a controversy, or a discussion anyway, about whether buildings should be flexible or stiff. The heavily reinforced, solid masonry and concrete buildings performed fairly well in the earthquake. The smaller buildings, the wood buildings, suffered a lot of damage, which started the fire. And then once the fire was through, I'm sure a lot of the buildings which otherwise would have come out unscathed probably were damaged by the fire.
The slow reconstruction of Tokyo and Yokohama is done with the 1923 disaster in mind.
関東大震災で大きな地震があったんで、これではまた立て直すっていう。
The Great Earthquake in Kantō was a turning point for Japanese people. To change the buildings to earthquake-proof and fire-proof structures.
They've also built with modern buildings effectively fire walls, structures that will line a particular direction to be a fire break if this ever happens again. But there is a lot of thought in terms of fighting fires, how to prevent these tragedies, how to have separate water sources that are independent of the water mains breaking.
After that, people started to prepare for the earthquakes. But when an event is over, and if there is nothing for 10, 20 years, they forget. So they designated September 1st, the day the great earthquake in Kantō happened, as the day of disaster prevention, to check around, so both officials and residents try to prepare for the disaster prevention.
It happened once, it will happen again, and everyone knows it will happen again. To what scale and what magnitude, people are predicting something equal. Whether that is a sense of resignation or a sense of inevitability, I think it's there in Japan.